Hello, welcome back. In between the last video and this one, I bought a Laconia sword for Chaz, and unless I miss my guess on how the game works, that's probably the last piece of gear I'm ever going to buy in this game. Yeah, that's how far into the game we are. It was a surprise to me too when I took a look at it. Anyway, we got a tower to storm. Right, and of course, we cannot miss those talk conversations. Just ignore the conversations that I probably missed earlier in the playthrough. That didn't happen. Now, while this tower is a lot less grueling than the air castle in a few ways, it is a long dungeon, to be sure, and there are a couple of complications that don't really show up in the others. One little bit of relief, though, is the enemy encounter table here. By comparison, the last dungeon, or at least the last half a dungeon I dealt with, was all Chaos Sorcerers all the time, and they were very taxing on resources. Also, just very dangerous in general if they got a surprise round on you. The encounter design is less of a problem here. That eyeball thing is a switch. There's only two in the entire dungeon, but they do both have important roles, and each one removes an obstacle to the way forward. And in typical RPG fashion, in a way that's not obvious the moment you press the switch, which is something I honestly don't want to think about too hard. These Frost Sabers are not the only enemy that visit us from the previous dungeon. Now, I'm keeping the shields on Kyra for now, because she can get by just fine with Hone and Flaylai. And there are some enemies that hit fairly hard, so I do benefit from keeping her double shielded for now. I never really got to use that flame sword that Chaz has available to him, which... oh, what can I say? Most of the dungeons I've gone through have a lot of fire-resistant enemies, which is not what one would expect from an ice planet, but what can I say? I'm sure it'd be useful for fighting overworld monsters, but we have the Ice Digger for that. Oh well. Maybe... oh wow, yeah, that was a little bit unlucky, but that is also the drawback of having Rune near the front lines. Even with two shields, his hit points are low, and crits seem to bypass defense somewhat, so that can happen. Well, guess I just gotta be more careful from now on. Also, we've now seen both the left and right of those blade enemies, but as far as I can tell, they do not show up in the same encounter in this dungeon, so don't worry, that'll happen later, and we will see some interesting stuff when that happens. Now, unlike the last dungeon, which was one... how shall I say? One figuratively living, breathing reference to a previous game, this one is a definitely living, possibly breathing, self-contained thing, which I don't think shows up in any of the other Phantasy Star games, and by that I mean I don't recall any dungeons that are themselves alive. As usual, correct me if wrong. Also, now that Rune has gained a few levels, he has more than one use of DM, and being the smart fellow that he is, his DM has a very high success rate, especially on physically based monsters, which there are a lot of those. So it's a nice skill to have. Just like that. Although, in retrospect, it might be better to save DM for another one or two kinds of enemies that show up later, because despite looking imposing, those Centaur guys, not games, are actually not all that durable. These palette swap guys, they use Force Flash, and of course that is scaled up so that it still hurts the party a decent amount, so they are definitely our first targets. And that was kind of by accident, but it is very nice to have a combination attack that's based purely on skills rather than techniques, so I can use them more or less whenever I can get away with it. I also don't particularly mind that they use the... Oh, Dark Marauders. These guys stand out a little bit because they are resistant to just about anything Rune can do. They resist fire, ice, and... I mean, technically you can hit them with Hone, but that's a bit of a waste, so Rune often gets kinda dead turns against these guys, which is not a common thing at all. But I'm glad that there's enough enemy variety where that's the case. And, of course, the same applies to Kyra when she doesn't have her slashers equipped, which is the case right now. There's something else I wanted to mention about those ghouls from a few encounters back. They're very easy to kill, do not do anything very scary, and wow, that actually could be worse. Yes, there's occasional Chaos Sorcerers here, I think on this floor specifically, and you can get 3 at once. I've been fortunate enough to not get ambushed by the 3 Chaos Sorcerer encounter, but it was still a little scary to see that thing staring at me. I mean, it's not fun to take 2 or 3 AoEs in one turn, but hey, I can't complain too much. At least they didn't all use Tandil and knock Wherein out instantly, more or less. But I think that these Chaos Sorcerer counters have been toned down a little because I noticed that they tend to use their finger lasers and flail-eye a little bit more often than they did in the Air Castle. Though that might just be luck on my part. Anyway, the thing I wanted to say about those ghouls is, despite being a very easy type of monster to deal with, their rewards are actually very good for when you win. And I say when because, well, turning that into an if question is a little absurd. These guys, they are quite durable. They don't hit that hard. They usually use single target techniques. And you can face 2 or 3 of them in one encounter. However, they don't have a combination attack like the boss version did. So it's perfectly safe to use full enemy party attacks on them. The main problem is that they just last a while. They can take a fair bit of punishment. When I first saw that doorway, I thought that you were just tearing the dungeon apart as you go through, but no, it's more of a Gradius thing. They just close up behind you. This is what changed my mind on what gear to equip on Kyra. Having a better slasher is very nice because it allows her to keep attacking after she runs out of flail eye, and that is a thing that can very easily happen in this dungeon. The encounters are not that punishing, but there are a lot of them. I also kind of like the idea that this dungeon pushes the Zio's Fort idea a little bit harder. That is, Zio's Fort technically looks like it might have had man-made architecture involved, at least as an idea, but the walls are actually more like living things. And when Dark Forest itself is involved, well, it looks more like this. They take that idea further. This is the sort of encounter where I push really hard on the area of effect attacks. And I feel weird saying area of effect because that implies the, I don't know, the newer online role-playing game idea where you target a certain area and it affects anything in it but misses anything outside of that. Whereas Phantasy Star 4 is a lot more binary on that sort of thing. It either hits everything or it hits one thing. Phantasy Star 3 was actually a little bit narrower on that. And Phantasy Star 2 as well. There were techniques that targeted a particular group of enemies, but wouldn't hit anything outside of that group. This mattered a lot more in Phantasy Star 2 than in 3. Although Phantasy Star 2 techniques were overall a lot better than they were in 3 in that they could be effective on things, there was a quirk that angered many people and was never brought back, and also I believe there's at least one fan patch that removes this problem. The problem being that your techniques can miss in that game. And Phantasy Star 2 is a game where you have to watch your technique point consumption very closely, and committing to attack techniques is a big deal. So having that miss is not great. And we have reached the point of the game where we're just throwing away trimates. I don't think I ever bought those things. I think there's one shop in the game where you can buy them. And now I just have so many Stardews and Saldews and the rest that trimates are they're just extra inventory space. Although in retrospect, whenever I run into that situation, I should just use a trimate, because this game is pretty friendly in that if you open a treasure chest and can't fit in your inventory, you can just put it back in the chest for you to work out at your leisure. Also, that encounter, I left that in to show that even though they were only one dungeon previous, my characters have advanced enough that they can just sort of gank a Chaos Sorcerer like that. This is the kind of encounter that's a little concerning. If I was smarter about this, I would start using a DM here instead of burning them on smaller enemies earlier, but, well, live and learn. This is another encounter where you want to lean heavily on multi-target attacks. I also lucked out a fair bit in that Chaz could have easily died there, and I can only blame my own laziness for healing my guys. And yep, I am out of Flail. It's a thing that can happen when you use that as your standard attack. Rune can do that pretty much as he wants, but unfortunately Kyra is a little more limited. But that's okay, because unlike Rune, Kyra can actually hit things without using any... well, yeah, without using any expendable resources. The difference between Moondew and Soldew, by the way, is that Moondew recovers a fourth of your character's health upon resurrection, whereas Soldew recovers all of it. And speaking of revival, I think it's fairly clever to have Chaz be the only character other than Rune who can use Rever. And that's so that if Rune gets knocked out, you have to spend some technique points that are in rather short supply. Like, the cost of that technique is pretty close to that of Nathu, and you don't want to run out of those. Now that I think of it, I haven't played a whole lot of games where there are characters with powerful techniques or magic or whatever you want to call it, but very low reserves to draw it from. And that's the case with both Chaz and Rika here. I mean, Chaz has the Sue line, of course, and Rika has the Sar line. I think it's fairly interesting game design. And even though, well, okay, this dungeon is designed to be a bit more misleading and twisty-turny than the others, but compared to some of the old games, it's still not a huge deal. And this encounter scared me a fair bit for the same reasons as the 3 Chaos Sorcerer would. I would not want to deal with 4 Force Flashes. Fortunately, the moment I get a single move, it would have been okay. I mean, getting all of those turns in a row is very nice, because letting those guys move is obviously bad. But the thing is, they have Gisar. So when I hit them with one multi-target technique or skill, that would pretty much nullify any... at least the one action by the enemy, so that's not a Force Flash. And their Gisar is not that strong. A Disrupt from Rika will definitely outdamage it. And we just learned Negatus, and that's what it does. Just full party instant death, and Rune's instant death power is fairly strong. This isn't to say that it couldn't be better, mind you, but since I only had one use of it and I just used it to show it off, there's not much more I can do for the time being. I think the choice of when to run away is... honestly, the best thing to do is to never run away, except if you encounter a sandworm and you're not ready for it. But aside from that, there are a lot of dungeons where monsters hit hard enough that you can't really take a risk of running away. And this becomes apparent the moment you encounter an enemy ambush with a tough group of monsters. Because at that point you get the idea of what it means for them to all get a free turn. I think its best use is, as tradition, a way to get away from weak enemies that you don't want to waste time on. I kind of like how the Suikoden series kind of makes this explicit, because when you're significantly more powerful than an encounter, the command of run switches to let go, and that has a 100% success rate, and the game says the enemy ran. I think that's a nice addition, and I'd like to see that more often. Now, I have a reason to show off this encounter. It's not to show off any particularly unusual bit of gameplay, although I believe I do something a little bit unusual here. It's more like I want to show off the animation that these guys have. Because while I did show their axe attack, they are able to use techniques. They are also fairly unusual among enemies that their agility is low, so I can use Eliminate. Obviously, we don't want a boosted Dark Marauder to attack us, but honestly, I'd rather deal with that than having the enemy attack twice. I don't think their shift is that powerful. I could be wrong, though. I mean, I didn't let them get away with it. It might be that they're just extremely punishing after they're buffed up. But either way. Ooh, this dungeon is fairly relentless, isn't it? I will be glad when it's over, even if it's not quite as dangerous as the air castle. Because this is a fairly long play. I've been editing out a lot of battle footage here. I think getting through this whole thing took me an hour real time. Also, you might have noticed that Kyra learned Nephoi, which means that she actually has something to bring to boss fights attack-wise. And in turn, this means that I have to be at least somewhat reserved with her technique points when healing. Of course, Midis is amazing, so I don't have to worry too much. But it does make the decision on which healing to use a little bit more involved. I'm out of air slash here. In fact, this encounter was to kind of show you what my resources were at skill-wise as I approach the end of this dungeon. I'm fine, more or less, for technique points, but all of the really powerful multi-attack skills are used up. And this is actually the encounter that I discovered agility affects more than turn order. It does, in fact, affect evasion as well. Before this, I was wondering if each character and enemy just had some sort of flat value, but that Saner, that proved me wrong. I guess the reason I didn't know about how that worked was because I mostly used it against bosses, and bosses, as far as I can tell, do not miss. Alright, I'm ready to go, and oh wait, every few steps, right? That's old school gaming. Bindwa is not very useful, by the way, it's just a sleep effect. I'm a little insulted that they gave me something so ineffective at this point in the game. Excuse me. I've been doing a lot of talking. Well, by my standards, anyway. You can tell by the face. Yep, 2 dark forces at the same time. And this also is apparent if you consider that people on Desolis have been talking about the Geruberg Tower and the snowfalls especially, which have been happening before we encountered the dark force at Kuron. So they definitely have been operating at the same time. The main thing that separates Dark Force 2 and Lashiek is that Dark Force 2 tends to use single target attacks a lot more. This is not to say that Dark Force 2 does not hit hard. I'll show that off very shortly. Or very soon, however you want to put it. Lightning Shower before I got the barrier up, and that was almost enough to one-shot Ren right there. In fact, it hurt everyone very badly. I guess that's what happens when Ren gets a bad agility roll in the first turn of a boss fight. That's the sort of thing that I would not have noticed if I had overgrinded like I usually do. It is perfectly okay to use Stardew in a situation like this. As I said, we're getting close to the end of the game, so what am I saving these things for? My inventory is full anyway. But with the barrier up, Lightning Shower is a lot easier to deal with. I mean, debuffs are useless, but buffs are another matter. I'm not gonna show off EFS on its own a whole lot because Grand Cross is a thing. In my experience, Dark Force 2 uses Shadow Breath a fair bit more than it uses Lightning Shower, which makes the boss not all that difficult to deal with. The main thing about it is that it is very durable. I was kind of waiting for that to happen, and that's because I can use these handy combination attack macros. And I can do that again with a different macro. Too bad I was a little bit too trigger happy with the EFS, but it's not all bad. Showing off animations is an important part of these playthroughs, after all. That being said, using a macro for Shooting Star is... well, it's a little decadent, that's the best way I can put it. I would have done a lot more damage just having everyone use their single target stuff individually. Oh, there is one thing I forgot to mention about Eliminate before. That Silver Tusk makes it very rare for Rika to have a better move than just attacking in a random encounter. I mean, with that thing she hits dark monsters especially so hard that she usually doesn't need to resort to a risky instant death. But Dark Marauders are worth it. I also think it's interesting that it took that long for Eliminate to be a reliable skill to use against anything. But what can you do? I think Evil Eye is a sleep skill, or maybe it's a paralyzed skill, I forget. Whichever it is, Ren doesn't care about those. He cares about that, though. It's a magic attack, and Ren doesn't tank those very well. By comparison, he's not gonna get instant-killed by anything anymore. And he has roughly unlimited recovers. So you could say that he tanks him okay, but it does stop him from attacking, which is not great. And that's it. Explode is not amazing. And, like the other Dark Force supported structures, that one disappears immediately. That is a nice music remix, I gotta say. Oh yeah, Kyra has accomplished everything that she's set out to do, so I guess she's on her way now. But isn't that different from the failure train that we've come to expect from Final Fantasy games? My first Final Fantasy game was 4, and even as someone very unfamiliar with JRPGs, I found it stood out that I couldn't actually accomplish anything until the very end of the game. Phantasy Star is not like that, even in Phantasy Star 2. Oh. Well, I guess that's another thing we've got to work out, huh? We've done a lot, so we're gonna investigate the temple or whatever is left of it next time. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you later.